Here's a quick video on how to create text that seems to extrude right out of your website's background texture. As you can see, the text area is a separate image, and when it's overlaid on a tiled background, it appears to extrude right out of the background texture. Background texture itself came from a freebie site. In background textures, I found one I liked under light gray on page 10. So I helped myself to a copy of this L Gray 154. And we're going to want to remember that it's 100 by 100 pixels. We'll need that when we get to setting the tiling values in 3ds Max. And back in Photoshop, here's the JPEG. I tiled a few of them together to make that little test background we saw earlier. But everything happens in 3ds Max, so let's start with a new scene. I'll hit Z to square up. First of all, we need to create a geometry in the standard primitives, and we want a simple box. This is going to be the object that we apply our background texture to once we've extruded our text pattern on one of its faces. So I'll draw it in the top view. I'm going to set it back just a bit from the horizontal axis. Right on the axis is where our text spline is going to get added by default. So let's just place the box where it isn't going to be in the way. Doesn't matter how big for starters, we'll just get it into the scene. And then set the sizes to approximately the size it would appear on a normal display. So I'm thinking I want to cover about 8 inches horizontally, and 2 lines of text means maybe 4 inches of screen vertically. We can trim off the extra in Photoshop, so if we make it a bit big, it's not a big deal. And length is actually thickness here, so 0.1 should be more than thick enough. Notice the segment settings here are all 1s at the moment. We're going to crank the width and height segments right up to 200 later, but the computer just crawls with that many polygons, so we'll hold off on that for a bit. We've still got the box selected, so we can right-click in the perspective view and Z for Zoom Extents All. Now I'm going to set the color here to something a little less random. How about blue? Right again in perspective view and wheel out. Alt middle around, then home and Z once more. Now we need some text. So we want to create a shape, and it's already on splines, so let's pick text. Now I wasn't happy with the 3-line version of that welcome text, so I think I want to try a 2-line version, quite a bit smaller this time. The parameters section is already open, so let's grab the slider and bring this down to where we can set some stuff. The right value for size is going to depend on what font we pick, so let's just rough it in at 5. Okay, what to say? Let's try Welcome To on the top, and Hobbyists Picks ampersand Stuff on the bottom. We can use spaces to kind of center this a bit. And if we click in the front view, oh, way too big. But let's right-click in the front view again anyway to turn off that text button, so we don't create a whole bunch of text objects. Then to select text again, we can hit H. And it was auto-named Text1, highlight, and OK. Now that it's selected, let's go to the Modify tab and set the size to 1. Closer. But this is probably a good time to add the light and camera. I'm going to make a quick change of color first. Green works for me. Okay, let's set up the top view so it's a bit easier to drop a camera in. So right-click to select, then wheel out so we can see our text and the box. The text is 2-dimensional, right on the axis line at the moment, but we can still see it there. Now we're ready to create, camera, standard is our only choice, and pick target camera. If we now drop it into the top view, we can point it so it looks through the text at the center of the box's front face. Now if we right-click to get left view and wheel out, middle drag to center, let's hit W to get the move gizmo selected, and if we can click right on top of that line between the camera and the target and drag the up stick till our camera is pointed right at the box's front face. Now if we right-click in perspective view and hit C to switch to camera view, well, we're in a bit tight for starters. Let's right click in the top view. Let's select the camera, but before we move it, let's double check what lens length we're using. That's the Modify tab in the Parameters section, and we see the default 43,456. That's actually human eye value. So since lens length is the enemy of depth perception, and we want depth in our text, let's take this right down to, say, 20. Okay, there's the whole box. Now we want to use the front view to center the camera a bit better. But first we want to select the line between the camera and its target, so we move both. That's probably easier in left view. Right click there to select, then click right on the line, and right click back up in front view to use the move gizmo sticks to center the camera right in the center. We want the camera view to be filled exactly horizontally, so we want to right click in left view and move the camera closer just until the edges of the box's front face fill the camera viewport. Next thing we want to do is replace the default scene lighting by creating a new light. We're going to need to manage the intensity of the light hitting our box face in order to get our text image to blend into the background properly back in the user's web browser. So right click on top view, wheel out a bit more to get ready. Then it's already on the Create tab, so we want Lights. Standard from the drop down should be fine for our purposes. And let's make it a target directional. Then we'll line up right behind the camera in the top view and drag the target just on the other side of our box. Let's right click in the left view and hit W to get ready to move. And if we can hit that line between the light and its target, we can use the up stick to get the light pointed right at the center. If we roll out a bit, hit Q so we don't accidentally move anything, and select just the light. The Modify tab is going to give us access to the Intensity Color Attenuation section. And that's where we're going to need to fine-tune the multiplier value a bit. Okay, so we've got our camera and light set. It's time to get back to the text. An easy way to select it is by name. So H to bring up the dialog. You'll see our camera and its target, our light and its target, our box, and the one we're looking for, our text object. Select that and hit OK. We're already on the Modify tab and Parameters section is open. So let's try 0.6 for a size. That's a bit small for Arial, but I don't actually want Arial. What seems to work best are fonts that display fairly thin, well-defined lines, not big shapes that flow together. I'm going to try a handwriting font this time. Bradley Hand ITC. Looked good earlier. With that picked, we can lock down the size. Let's try 0.7. Still a bit small. Try 0.8. That's about the letter size, but I think things are going to be easier to read if we add a bit of kerning. 0.1. That's a bit much. Let's try 0.08. Okay. I'm going to center up the text a bit and then take one last pass at the size. So at a size of 0.7, there isn't enough box face surrounding the text. We want more than enough flat surface surrounding the raised text so we can crop with Photoshop later. 0.65 looks a bit better. One more tweak positioning. Our light is pointed at the center of the box's face, so we'll position our text spline right in the middle. Now, finally, the tricky part. So the first tricky thing is to convert the text object to an editable poly. So morph it right from spline to poly. So H to pull up the name selection, highlight, and OK. It's already on the Modify tab, so right-click on text and choose Editable Poly. The second tricky thing is to move the new Editable Poly object really close to the box's front face. Right-click in the top view, wheel in and drag the Move Gizmo sticks a couple of times. Looks like the text is somewhere around 0.1 inches in front of the box. I'm guessing that because it's about the same distance in front of the box as the box is thick. Well, we've reached the part where the machine is really going to start lagging during some operations. The reason is that we're about to request the maximum possible number of polygons on our box's front face. We're doing that so that when we extrude the letter shapes, they don't get all flattened and unreadable. Let's right-click in front view and hit Q so we don't accidentally move anything, and select the box. The Modify tab and Parameter sections are open, so let's set width segments to 200, And height segs to, well, it actually doesn't matter as long as we use at least 200. See, if we enter 300, 3ds Max sets the value right back to a maximum of 200 anyway. Now, more trickiness. With the box selected, the segment count cranked, the text spline converted to editable poly and placed very close to the box's front face, we go Create, Geometry, Compound Objects from the drop-down, and we want to pick Boolean. If we scroll down to the Operations section, we want to union our operands. The easiest point to grab the text object is probably going to be left view, so right-click there and wheel in a bit, middle drag to center. That shouldn't be too tough to hit the text object. Let's hit Pick Operand B, and over to left view and click the text object. And since everything turned white, we know we have a Boolean object instead of a box and an editable poly. Selecting it by name shows the default name stayed box 1, but if we highlight and OK, then the Modify tab shows we have a Boolean. What we need to be able to do now is select those polygons that used to be the text object. That means first right-click on Boolean and convert it to an editable poly. Now we can open the modifier itself on the stack and click on Polygon to get into Polygon Sub-Selection mode. And you'll see the yellow square showing we're in sub-selection mode. That lets us know a lot of things aren't going to work right until we get back out of sub-selection mode again. Let's click the Selection button and make sure we're making a square shape selection. Then let's right-click in the left view and select the polygons that used to be the text object. And if we right-click and then wheel in front view, we see the text polygon selected and ready for pulling out our text pattern. Still in polygon selection mode, with the text polygons selected, let's open the soft selection area on the Modify tab and check Use Soft Selection. Here's where you start to notice that lag. Because after a couple of seconds, the entire front view shows as completely selected. The reason we've lost our text selection is because the default fall-off value is way too high. Setting that to 1 is still way too high. We want blue or even some white between the letters in the top view. Otherwise our text is going to be all run together and unreadable. 0.3 is looking better. 0.2 and 0.18. There, that should give some separation between the letters. What we are adjusting here is the degree to which the nearby polygons on our block's front face will be affected when we move the polygons that make up our text pattern. Now here's where we can accidentally stack up huge amounts of work for the processor. We're going to be moving our selected polygons away from the box's front face with the Move gizmo. The problem is that each time we move the gizmo and stop for a second, 3ds Max tries to do a screen redraw. With 200 polygons by 200 polygons, that takes so long, it's tempting to move the gizmo again and again. Each time the processor stacks up another complete redraw. The trick is to move the selected polygon once and then sit and wait for it to redraw. If it's not ideal, we'll move and then sit and wait again. So right-click in the left view, hit W to bring up the Move gizmo, and with that yellow horizontal stick, let's click, drag, and release. Now we wait. You can see over in perspective view that we're getting there. A bit further, I think. So click, drag, release, and wait. Perfect. There's a few variables that influence the soft selection, that pinch and bubble, but for our purposes, this is perfect. While we're still in polygon sub-selection mode, and we still have the old text polygons selected, let's hit delete. So if we click on editable poly again in the modifier stack, we see the yellow box disappear, and we're out of sub-selection mode. Let's collapse the editable poly modifier down, and right-clicking in camera view, then P to convert to perspective. Alt middle around, looks nice. And let's use C to get back to camera view. We're on the home stretch. Before we can set up the skin in the material editor, we need to lock down what size the output is going to be. I found about 100 pixels per inch seems to work all right. So we modeled the box face at 8 inches by 4 inches, so about 800 by 400 pixels should be about right for the output size. Let's lock that down right now by going to the Render menu and picking Render Setup. On the Common tab, we've got output size here. There's output width, set that to 800, and output height, that's 400. If we grab the slider and drag down to get to the render output settings, we first need to click on the Files button and then enter the name for the JPEG file we're going to create. I like EXT for extruded, and this is the 2-line version, and it's the welcome text. And JPEG from the drop-down should be perfect. The default output location for our JPEG is going to be the render output subdirectory under the current project. So as long as we know where to find it, that should be fine. Okay, we hit save, and up comes the JPEG quality dialog. Since this is an intermediate file between 3ds Max and Photoshop, we want to make sure we've got this turned up to best image quality. And OK to the JPEG settings. Let's set this viewport drop down to our camera, and then click the button to lock that viewport as the renderer's source window. A quick double check back at the top to make sure we're requesting just a single image, and then let's render one. Alright, the end's in sight. So we know our output is 800 by 400, and we remember back to when we downloaded our texture swatch that it's 100 by 100. That's all we need to set up our tiling values in the material editor. So M to bring it up. The sample slot in the upper left is selected, so that one's as good as any. Standard material, bling shader, all the defaults. We want to click on the map button on the diffuse color channel, and then double click on bitmap in the material map browser. I put a second copy of that Elgray 154 JPEG in the Scene Assets Images folder in the current project. Let's double click that. Now, that puts us up on the diffuse color branch, where we set how we want to tile our 100 by 100 background swatch over the face of our box. Since we set up our camera to make the 8-inch model dimension take up exactly the width of our image, and we set the output width of our image to 800 pixels, the math is dead easy. We need to tile the swatch 8 times horizontally and 4 times vertically, and we want the little check marks checked to enable tiling. It's hard to get an idea how the skin will look on a flat surface from looking at that ball in the sample slot. Let's just set the sample object to a square. Okay, well, let's do it. We drag the skin onto our box in the camera viewport, and the sample slot borders show we made a good connection. Let's hit Show Map in Viewport. Okay, the lighting looks pretty close already. Let's close the material editor and render one. From the rendering menu, pick Render. It's making sure we're okay with overwriting that first render we did when we were setting up our output settings. Let's say we don't need any more reminders with this check mark, and then yes to overwrite. Okay, that looks alright. I think it's a bit darker than that Elgray 154 background at the moment. Let's lighten it up a bit, and then we'll switch back to Photoshop and do a check. Let's right-click in the top view and wheel out till we can see our light. And if we hit Q, we can make sure we don't move it. And then click right on the light. It's already on the Modify tab, and we opened the Intensity Color Attenuation area earlier. Let's move the multiplier value up to 1.1. You can see our text doesn't look so great in the camera view. And if we go to Rendering and Render, okay, that's definitely too high. So close the render window. Let's take the multiplier down to 0.9. Our text in the camera viewport is definitely looking a bit too dark. Let's render again. So rendering and render. Yep, no surprise there. Okay, looks like we may have things set up so that value wound up needing to be just about exactly 1.0. So let's close the render window and set 1.0. Camera view looks pretty good. Rendering, render. So let's get that into Photoshop and see how close we are right now. Back in Photoshop, let's start by opening that JPEG we just rendered in 3ds Max. The output directory there was the render output subdirectory in the current project folder. And it started with EXT for extrude, And there's our two-line version of the welcome text JPEG. Let's pick the selection tool from the toolbar, drag a rectangle from upper left. Now what we want to do here is crop fairly tight. We're leaving a bit of perfectly flat surface all the way around. We're going to copy and paste this selection into a new document window that's even smaller. That will give us a chance to move it around a bit to center it. Okay, that looks good. Let's Control C to copy the selection. Then File, New. Okay, we want to shave about 10 pixels off each dimension. And we want a nice round number in both directions. How about 770 by 190? Hit OK, then Control V to paste it in. Let's pick the Move tool, and we'll eyeball this right into the middle. Apparently we've got our snaps turned on at the moment. So let's go up to View, and down to Snaps, and get that check mark out of there. Now let's place the raised text right in the middle. Okay, let's select all, Control C to copy, and let's flip over to that test background we used earlier. Let's just turn off the 3-line text image, and we can use Control V to add a layer with that 2-line version we just made. Alright, let's get the on-screen size up to 100%. Those edges look just fine. Normally we need to try a few multiplier values to get a match this good. Each tweak would require re-rendering in 3ds Max and re-importing the resulting JPEG back into Photoshop. But for our purposes, this is good enough. Okay, last little bit. Let's flip back to our cropped image. We'll save the Photoshop document in case we need it. Let's call it Welcome to 770 190. And OK. Then let's save as. And we use a JPEG since we don't have any animation or transparency to worry about with this. Let's set the target directory to the Dreamweaver work directory for the site, and we'll put it in the images subfolder there. And if we switch to Dreamweaver, there's no change in the code view. You'll see we're just using a simple pair of divs. And in the CSS, you'll see the outer one is side to side, so we need to set the height to the height of our image. So height 190px. The inner div is just there for its background image. That's welcome to 770 190.jpg. And it's the same height, so 190. And the width is 770. The HobbyPix server is actually just the Apache service running on this machine. So all we have to do to upload to the server is save all. And if we flip-flop this live view button, you can see in the design pane, we seem to have spelled everything right. Let's try IE. And Firefox. Well, hope this helped, and I invite you to drop by hobbypix.com sometime.